Okay, well, I'd like to welcome everybody to today's seminar, and I have our speaker at the front here, Dr. Andrew Clarke, who recently joined UNSW from the University of Queensland. I'm Hal Paulson, and I'm a professor in City Futures Research Centre and who hosts this series. And I'm really introducing Andrew because Andrew and I have been working together for some time before Andrew moved here from Queensland and continuing at the moment. So Andrew is a sociologist by background, but he's focused a lot on housing and in particular homelessness in his postdoctoral role at UQ and continuing now, where he's now a lecturer in sociology at UNSW. So I think before going any further, I'd very much like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on, the Bidjigal people, and recognise that the land has never been ceded, and I'd like to pay my respects to any elders who are present and to generally to elders past and present. So I think with all of that, I'll pass over to Andrew, and if anybody could just indicate if there's any audio or visual problem as we're going through, then we can, because if there's silence from the other end at the moment, so I guess you're all, are we automatically muted, everybody? Is that how it works?
Yes.
Okay, so we can unmute you at the end when we will have a discussion and questions can be raised. So over to you, Andrew.
All right, thank you very much, Hal, and thank you, City Futures, for hosting me. This is my first seminar or live speaking event since, including lecturing since coming to UNSW, so it's exciting. I also want to say a special thank you to Ali for the setup and fielding all my confused emails and stuff today. So thank you. So the presentation I'm going to give today is based on a paper which I meant to put at the front, but it's actually at the end of the presentation, so you'll see it at the end in the details. That I recently published in the journal Housing Studies with some colleagues, Linda Cheshire, Cameron Carsell at UQ, and Alan Morris at UTS here in Sydney, called Ratification, Scarcity and the Problem Space of Need, Unpacking Australian Social Housing Policy. So basically what I'm going to do today is give a kind of overview of the argument that we present in that paper and some of the evidence for that argument. I thought I might be clever and be able to do that.
I might use the, sorry,
this one?
with the technical yes. I promise it's
That's
all
right,
right.
that's all right. It's all part of the fun.
There you go.
There we go.
Yeah, there we go. Great.
Right, so just up and down on the...
Yeah, I'm so sorry about that.
That's all right. Had far worse technical problems in doing live presentations in the last couple of, or hybrid presentations in the last couple of years, so don't worry. So I'm actually going to ignore my first slide and start off and introduce the paper the way that we introduce it in the actual written piece, is to start off with an anecdote that gives you a sense of the impetus behind this paper and why we came to write it and pursue this problem. And that is that over the last few years, 5 or 6 years, working as a researcher in the housing and homelessness space and doing a lot of contract research for government, program reviews, policy analysis, that kind of stuff. We're increasingly struck by the way in which people in the policymakers and other policy actors spoke about social housing and the lack of social housing in our engagements with them. And what was striking about this is that we would talk about the impact of the undersupply of social housing on the programs that we were funded to evaluate, housing first programs, supportive housing programs, various other things, programs for people exiting prison. And the response that we would get from policymakers was to sort of lament this lack, but to talk about it as if it was something that they and the system that they represented had no control over. that it was some kind of external constraint that they, and by extension we, as people working with them, had to just manage and find ways around. And our response naturally would be like, you guys are the government. You know, the supply of social housing is a function of, you know, many things, but particularly policy decisions. You know, at different levels, of course, you know, the individual bureaucrat might not have control, but you know, the system has control. So why are we talking about it in this way? It's as a problem that we have no control over. And so that really that was kind of the impetus for this particular paper. And basically what we try and do in the paper is to provide a bit more of a sort of systematic analysis of what's going on here, what are the processes around this kind of what we call in the paper a reification of social housing scarcity. So the treatment of social housing scarcity is like a kind of a thing, an object external to human activity that, you know, exerts power on us. And so we tried to sort of provide a systematic analysis of why this is going on or how this is playing out. So in the paper, what we sort of, the conclusion that we come to is one of the things, well, basically we argue that in a way this is the product of the fact that policy making today, social housing policy making and the debates that surround it, take place in the context of decades of residualisation of the social housing sector, right? So one of the sort of key arguments in the paper is that we now that social housing policy is now made in the shadow of residualisation and is tied up with the sort of managing the effects of that or working within the conditions that has created. And for those who aren't aware of what that word means, residualisation means the simultaneous shrinking of the social housing sector and its increased targeting at those people with the greatest needs, right? You know, as supply goes down, then you ration it by targeting at those with the greatest needs, and it becomes residual vis-a-vis the rest of the housing sector or other housing tenures, private rental, home ownership, and the like. So one of our key arguments is that policy making operates in the shadow of residualisation and is shaped by many ways of the consequences of that process. One of our other key points is that this tendency to reify social housing scarcity is kind of driven by a preoccupation amongst policymakers with identifying who are the neediest people, right? So there's this imperative driven by social housing residualisation to target, to ration, to find who is the most neediest. And this leads to a kind of preoccupation with defining and operationalising need and balancing different kinds of needs and making sure that the stock that exists is targeted. So one of the things that we demonstrate in the paper, and I'll talk about in more detail, is this preoccupation with the concept of neediness. And I'm going to look at the way in which it's defined and deployed and the kinds of struggles that emerge around that. And then finally, I will talk about how this contributes to this sense of social housing scarcity being something, a reified thing, right? A thing that's external to policy making that exerts power or affects policy making. And basically what I will argue is that this preoccupation with neediness and defining needs and managing the impacts of residualisation leaves it to stand outside of that process as something that's sort of just taken for granted that we have to manage the effects of. So that's a kind of synopsis of what I'm going to say. Maybe it's down, not across. No, that's all right. All right. So the paper draws on data we collected as part of this ARC linkage project called Waithood, the Experience of Waiting for Social Housing. And there is kind of a cast of thousands on the project, including Hal Pawson, who's in the room, and my colleagues who I mentioned are also on the paper. Just a bit of brief context about the project so you know where I'm coming from and where the data's coming from. The sort of central aim of this project is to understand life on the social housing waitlist, what it's like for people who are deemed, in administrative terms, to be unable to meet their housing needs within the private market, but then thanks to a lack of social housing, spend an extended period of time, in many cases, waiting in limbo with those, needs that are defined as being unable to be met with the private market. So it's a question of what happens, what do they do, how do they get by, and how are they managed by a whole range of policy actors, government and non-government. What we're doing at the moment is we're in the process of speaking to people who are on the social housing waitlist. It's been in the process for a while, thanks to COVID, things stopping and starting and whatnot. That's sort of the end, maybe I'd say the third stage of the project. What I'll be talking about primarily in this part of the project is the way in which the social housing waitlists are managed, right? So I'll be drawing on some policy analysis that we've done and also interviews that we've done with a group that we'll just call, we've been calling for shorthand policy actors, people in government and in the non-profit sector who engage with people who are applying and waiting for social housing. So that will include it includes people in sort of higher levels of sort of housing departments, people on the ground in some cases, although they were harder to get to, in frontline housing officers, and a whole suite of different non-profit, non-government organisations, representatives from those organisations who support people often to try and get onto social housing waitlists and to find a way to live in the meantime. And we also spoke to some peak bodies, housing peak bodies as well. There's also the other stage of the project was a massive analysis of waitlist policy and statistics carried out by Hal Pawson and David Lilly, who are on the project, and that's due to be released as a report. We can give it a plug. Hal, is it next week? So keep an eye out for that. I was having a look at it and there's some really interesting data in there. All right, here we go. All right, let me give a bit of background about sort of how we got here, a bit of a kind of, I guess, literature review for the paper. So, and this, I mean, I won't go into a lot of detail here because I think a lot of people will be familiar with these kind of ideas and debates and historical processes. But I guess I'll start by saying that social housing in the developed world, particularly in English-speaking countries, has gone through a process that we often, some of us at least, refer to as a neoliberalisation. So there's been a whole suite of changes that have been brought about following a change in thinking about welfare provision, the role of the state in addressing people's needs vis-a-vis the market, all of that kind of stuff. And so this saw large-scale public provision of housing problematized from about the late 1970s, right? And that large-scale provision had sort of been ongoing for about 30-odd years following the end of the Second World War. With the rise of neoliberal ideas, we saw social housing come to be critiqued, problematized as being a kind of breeding ground for welfare dependency, as creating dependency amongst low income and poor people. It became seen as rather than a source or a way of addressing or a solution to poverty, as actually an incubator of poverty and a cause of poverty. And it also came to be seen as representing bureaucratic inefficiency as compared to the efficiency of private markets. And so this resulted in, through a series of policy changes over time, declining investment in social housing, which really occurred here in Australia from the 1990s, a shrinking of supply, which I spoke about earlier, and ballooning social housing waitlists, right? So waitlists blowing out and people waiting for a very long time. And so this is the kind of background to that process of residualisation that I was speaking about at the beginning. Thanks, Alan. So social housing, or what was then simply public housing, was formerly seen as a source of affordable housing for low-income households on a much sort of wider, less targeted kind of basis. With the changes that I was just speaking about, it has been increasingly reconceptualised as a welfare service, or now an ambulance service, as Hal and Suzanne Fitzpatrick have called it in her paper from about 10 years ago, where it is sort of targeted at those people that are, who Zygmunt Bauman would refer to as the sort of failed consumers of modern consumer society. Those people who, for reasons of, in the minds of policymakers at least, and some others, personal deficiencies, are unable to meet their housing needs within the private market, right? So they're failed consumers, they're people with complex needs, high needs, and they need this welfare service or ambulance service to, keep them from really bottoming out. In this context, we see residualisation occur through the dwindling of social housing stock and its increased targeting at those with the highest needs, right? And I guess what I was trying to do with this slide, and maybe haven't articulated particularly well, is that there's a kind of logic to residualisation. It's not just something that happens, that this idea that social housing is a kind of welfare service that's only for the needy, only for those who are unable to meet their needs with the private market, leads to a kind of logic of targeting and a sense that it's not, we don't need widespread provision, right? It's only meant to support this narrowly defined group. So, yeah. Next slide, please, Ali. Thank you. So going back to, I kind of said some of this stuff at the beginning, so our order has gone, my order has gone a bit crazy. But as I said at the beginning, that one of the key sort of arguments of the paper is that residualisation has, which I've spelled terribly here, I don't know what's happened, produces a whole new set of governmental problems, challenges, imperatives that animate social housing policy making, particularly around the allocation of social housing, which has been our focus more so in this project, and that you can see coming through in the kinds of problems, the attitudes and the strategies of policy actors working in this sector. So scarcity, as I said at the beginning, creates an imperative to ration available stock, and there's pressure on those working in the sector to find new ways of differentiating amongst needy applicants, right? So if you've got a dwindling supply, growing needy population, vis-a-vis a growing needy population, there's this sort of imperative then to find new ways of rationing. How do we split, differentiate amongst the needy more and more, and to allocate and ration this scarce resource? And this leads to questions over how need should be defined, assessed, triaged, and need becomes a kind of core focus. Defining and operationalising need becomes a core focus for policy making and debate. All right, next slide. We have, in the paper, we conceptualise this situation, context in which policy is made in the context of residualisation, drawing on a concept from this fuzzy man, I couldn't find a better picture of him on the screen here, Stephen Collier, which is the concept of a problem space. So Collier draws this concept out of the philosopher Michel Foucault's work on the idea of problematization. And it's used to, and he uses it and we borrow it to use it, to refer to a set of practical and kind of discursive conditions that render certain problems salient. So the idea is that the way in which the kinds of problems that policymakers, governments, other actors working in this space are attuned to or motivated to address are shaped by the legacy of past decisions and the expert and policy discourses that they have engendered or that have sprung up to try and address those, right? So it's really about looking at what are the conditions within which policy making and debate take place. And from my earlier discussion, I hope you can see that we see residualisation, and the impacts of residualisation is giving rise to a certain problem space. It's given rise to a certain set of practical conditions in terms of social housing scarcity, amongst other things, and discursive conditions about what social housing is for, i.e. Capturing as a kind of safety net or an ambulance for those who fall out of the private rental sector or the private market, fail to meet their own needs within the private market. Okay, thank you. All right, I'm going to move on to some of the findings now. So one of the first things, well, the first thing that we look at in the paper is how this concept of neediness that we are sort of seeing as kind of central to this problem space, to this new problem space opened up by residualisation, gets defined. Next slide, thank you. So defining neediness, we argue, is a key preoccupation within the problem space for reasons that I spoke about before. And this is linked to the kind of challenge produced by residualisation of rationing social housing vis-a-vis a housing affordability crisis and growing need. And I'll provide an example here with a quote from the New South Wales Government's Future Directions for Social Housing Policy, published in 2016, where they say, demand for social and affordable rental is increasing. An increasingly unaffordable private rental market for people on low incomes, responses to homelessness, they mean improved responses to homelessness, and fewer social housing vacancies have driven growth in the social housing waitlist, which has now reached 60,000 households in 2016. At the same time, people are staying in social housing longer. So basically what they're laying out here is this problem, right? That we've got more and more people coming in need of social housing, or at least claiming to be in need of social housing from these various processes, causes. And we have that, people are staying in social housing. And I mean, I won't get into that side of it too much because it's a whole other thing. But they're laying out basically this problem, which, if we can go to the next slide, please, the answer to is to find new ways of understanding, categorising and targeting people based on their level of need. So yes, defining neediness becomes oriented to meeting this challenge, right, of allocating social housing in the context of growing demand, but not growing supply. One of the ways, or I guess one of the dimensions to the way that neediness gets defined to meet this challenge is in terms of people's capacity for independence. And this links back to the idea that social housing is reserved for those who are least able to sustain private housing. And this again comes through in the Future Directions document that I quoted before. So after the problem is laid out in that quote that I gave previously, the document goes on to say, this strategy refines the focus on need, right? The problem is dwindling supply, pressure, how do we deal with that? We refine the focus on need. And to do that, we identify two broad groups of social housing tenants. One, which they call the safety net group, who are people who require support for an extended period of time. And the second is what they call the opportunity group, people who can be helped to become more independent so they no longer require social housing and government assistance. So, and I think maybe go to the next slide, please, Alex. I think I elaborate on this no, maybe not. That's all right. So what we can see going on in that quote is that people are being differentiated in terms of their capacity for independence. They're saying there's one group who we really can't expect to secure their own housing needs independently within the private market, and we'll talk about those in more detail in a moment. But there's another group who, we can provide some support, enhance their capacity for independence. They're less needy, therefore we need that they can be, I guess, screened out or filtered out. And this is because they are that group is seen as being as having the opportunity to re-engage with the private market. This attitude, this view was also present in the other states. I forgot to mention the project was collected data in Queensland, Tasmania and New South Wales. And one of our Queensland government interviewees gave the following quote, which sort of resonates with this idea of, or this conception of neediness as capacity for independence. She said, "It's not an official term, but we do talk about assisting people to get to their level of independence. So we know that everybody's got different needs, and we know that they might vary over time. But if people are capable of, with just a little bit of assistance, obtaining or maintaining some sort of private market solution, why wouldn't we try to assist them to do that and not necessarily have a square box of assistance that we have provided previously, that being social housing?" Next slide, please. Okay, so the inverse, the flip side of this coin of neediness, so one aspect of it is that it's conceptualized in terms of capacity for independence. The kind of other side that applies to that other group that don't have the opportunity, quote unquote, to return to the private market, is a conception of neediness in terms of levels of complexity. So there is recognition, as we saw in the Future Directions document, that independence is not possible for some, and this is based on calculations about how complex their needs are, right? There's been some work on the emergence of this idea of complex needs in the welfare discourses, welfare policy discourses and research generally, including by this person Dobson. I mean, my sense is that it's sort of come out of the homelessness sector in particular, and with the kind of emergence of the Housing First movement and all of that kind of stuff. But we're really seeing it come through strongly in social housing policy as well. So here, complexity is understood as people as having intersecting and compounding needs, right? So it's not simply that you are homeless, but you are also homeless with a severe mental illness and maybe a substance addiction, right? And that those needs aren't just additive, they don't just add up to an overall sense of what your need is, they intersect with one another and they worsen each other intensely. So there's a kind of compounding impact, right? And this is seen as kind of more disabling of these individuals and of their capacity for independence than the sum total of these needs on their own. So what we see then in terms of how a scarce supply of social housing is targeted is one way in which it is targeted is by calculating how complex people's needs are and trying to target those with the greatest complexity. And this comes through in some of our stakeholder quotes. First one from the New South Wales government. The person talks about, in the application for social housing assistance, there are questions that will indicate to us whether a client has indicators of urgent or complex needs. But I think the second one is actually more interesting and more telling about the way that neediness is being conceptualised here. From the Tasmanian government, this person says, "We really monitor and tightly audit this and question, why are people on the housing register? Why are they on the social housing waitlist? Why are they priority applicants? Why are we prioritising these particular people for housing when there's so many people in need of it?" Yes, affordability, most of them struggle with housing affordability. You can tick that off for most of them, but it's actually their security of tenure. It's their degree of homelessness. And the majority do actually have homelessness, right? So even homelessness alone is not sufficient necessarily to be prioritised or to access social housing in a timely manner. They also have other issues like health and mobility reasons, a high proportion of disability, high proportions of mental illness that would be meant to be, drug and alcohol reasons, all of these kind of things. And what we see happening here, I think, is that at the same time as, so neediness is sort of being defined as a way of sort of improving, tightening, targeting by finding, ever more fine-grained ways of differentiating amongst social housing applicants. One of the kind of impacts of this, and in some ways could be seen positive, at least for some people, is that the idea of complexity actually legitimizes dependence on social housing for this narrow group, because you have the policy logic sort of saying that, we recognise that because of the complexity of need, this group are unable to meet their needs with the private market, in the private market. And this is significant because we know from the research over the last 20 years that social housing tenants are a highly stigmatised population, and the policy making and politics has been key to this, right? They've been characterised as welfare dependents, as people engaged in antisocial behaviours, people who are irresponsible, who basically reject the norms of consumer society and the values of consumer society. And so one of the things, and I'm preempting my conclusion here, one of the things that I think we see happening with this legitimation is a kind of shift away from that sort of stigmatising logic, but only for an increasingly narrow group of people. All right, next slide, thank you. All right, I'll move on to the second finding of the paper now, which is, or section of analysis in the paper, which is struggles over neediness. So we talked about the way in which neediness, there's these kind of creative ways of defining it to help ration dwindling social housing stock. This places a premium on being designated as needy, and having that being categorised as having complex needs there becomes a kind of, something to be strived for people trying to access social housing, and the people, typically services, homelessness services and other sort of trying to support to them. And like anything that gets valued, this leads to struggles. Next slide, thank you. So the valorisation of neediness makes it a focal point of policy struggle and contestation. Policy actors are, of course, approaching the question of neediness from different standpoints. You have governments who are, the imperative there is to ration, and you have service providers, particularly non-government organisations, advocacy organisations, who are trying to broaden the conception of neediness, or who gets deemed needy, or how neediness is operationalised, to ensure that people who they are working with gain access to social housing, people who they think have a real need. And yes, so this centres around questions of who should and should not be housed, in what order, how neediness should be, measured and determined, and all of this kind of stuff. Next slide, please. So, sorry, I keep preempting things that I'm going to say on the previous slide. So this gives rise to controversies over how neediness is operationalised, right? And this includes debates amongst different policy actors about how needs are assessed and how they're triaged. And this was a particularly prominent discussion in Queensland. There was a lot of argy-bargy about how needs were measured, what kind of tools were used, was the government using tools at all? How were they making these kind of decisions, right? And non-government actors in particular were highly critical of what they saw as an inconsistency or non-transparency in the way that neediness was being defined. And they raised issues of fairness, transparency, and in particular people falling through the cracks. I've got a couple of examples here. One Queensland community service, a non-government person says, I think across government and the community services sector, the assessments aren't consistent. We're not using the same tools. We're not using the same or different tools to the same level of capability. We've had plenty of meetings with government about, look, the sector's saying this isn't working and people should be eligible. People who should be eligible are being deemed ineligible and aren't getting through. So what can we do? Another interviewee, this time from New South Wales, says, I think overall it's a pretty decently set up system, except for the fact there's a lack of transparency. When the department breaks the rules and comes in over the top and says, we're making a special allocation, this person we're deeming to be having urgent or very complex needs, they need to be housed urgently, and this person thinks that introduces a level of unfairness into the system. So here it's about The first one, it's about consistency and having the right tools. The second one is kind of about transparency of how needs are defined. Next slide, please, Ali. Now, I think what's interesting about this is not that I want to weigh into these, or that we in the paper want to weigh into these debates and say this is right, this is wrong, these people have a legitimate grievance, you know, which they probably do. And the point that we want to draw out is that this valorisation of neediness and the struggles that this engenders preoccupies policymaking attention, and the kind of politics around policymaking, the debate that happens around the question of neediness, and takes it away from the underlying problem, right? That you don't have enough social housing to meet the levels of, I guess, demand, or you could say need, that people are being presented with. So the struggles themselves contribute to that overall process of ratification that I mentioned at the beginning. Sorry, I'm seeing what I've said here and what I haven't. So yes, these struggles concentrate policymaking energies and debates on improving needs-based targeting. This is where energy goes. This is where our kind of innovations sort of are focused, and this is where, as a researcher trying to, you know, work with governments, being contracted by governments, what they want you to focus on is ways of improving these kind of processes. There's a focus on improving training of staff, shared assessment tools, better allocation systems, all of this kind of stuff, all things around process, and not looking at the sort of broader problem. A couple of examples again. Maybe I'll just read one of them because I've run out of time otherwise. This person from, a non-government person from Queensland says, there's been more attention to the careful engagement and assessment of people at the front line through housing service centres. So they're the government's front line, you know, place where you go into as an applicant to apply for social housing and the various processes that surround that. We also help government by providing structured feedback from the sector to that implementation of that, like what's going well, what's not going well, blah, blah, blah. So what you can see here is there's a lot of energy and attention given to this problem. That's the point that I'm trying to make and the reason that we put those things up. Okay, next slide, please, Ali. So the last piece of analysis we present in the paper is about the implications of this, or the impact of this in terms of the reification of social housing scarcity. Next slide, thank you. So we argue that this preoccupation with neediness, the struggles around how it is defined and operationalised, and the policy making and energies and innovations that sort of stem from that, means that the scarcity, the problem that's behind all of this, is increasingly taken for granted. It's seen by policy actors as a natural and unavoidable constraint on their activities, as I said at the beginning, and they see needs-based targeting in this effort to find ever more fine-grained ways of differentiating need as simply a necessity, right, a practical necessity. And I've got a few quotes that illustrate this view. First one from Tasmania, Danny says, you've got to remember that this is gatekeeping because we don't have an infinite resource to be able to apply to community need. It needs to be a rationed application. Anna from Queensland simply says, it's supply versus demand, right? We need to target because, you know, demand outstrips supply. Claire, also from Queensland, says, if the market was suddenly flooded with so many houses that every house was competing for a tenant rather than the other way around, maybe assessments wouldn't be so important. But in the market that we've got, it becomes more important to be good at this stuff and have the right tools. Next slide, please, Ellen. So what we see here is the ratification of social housing scarcity, right? It becomes seen as, just on this last top point here, something that's independent of policy making, right? That's independent of the human activities that make up policy making. It's like in those quotes, the finitude of natural resources. There just isn't enough. It's like there just isn't enough coal for us to burn, or, you know, that kind of thing, right? It's a finite thing. It's a, you know, it's a natural constraint on what we can do, or it's treated as, you know, like the vicissitudes of self-regulating markets. You know, this is just the way that the market works. I don't know how social housing is conflated with the market, given that it's, you know, a product of policy-making decisions. But anyway, in the paper, we conceptualise this as the reification of scarcity, and we draw on Berger and Luckman's classic definition of reification in their book, 67 book, The Social Construction of Reality. And they define reification as the apprehension of human phenomena as if they were things, that is, in non-human or possibly suprahuman terms. Another way of saying this is that reification is the apprehension of the products of human activity as if they were something other than human products. And I feel like you can't see a better example of this process than the way that these policy actors are talking about social housing scarcity. Next slide, please, Ali. This attitude or tendency is not uniform amongst everyone, and nothing ever is, and shouldn't be considered necessarily as a fait accompli, as something that can't be challenged. Some policy actors do question the assumptions of this problem space, right? And I provided a quote here, a person who I've chosen not to provide a pseudonym for some reason, from a community service in a large community service provider in Brisbane. This person said, "I think the government's done a really poor job at selling social housing." And by selling here, she doesn't mean like literally selling it for money. They mean like convincing people of its worth, right? So the government's done a poor job of selling social housing because I don't think you should sell housing on need. Housing is a human right. It makes sense that everyone needs a home. And I just think it's wrong to say it's all about need. It's about income and need. It's about affordability and need. You know, there's more going on here than just needs-based targeting. So there are challenges, and there are people sort of thinking outside of this particular box. Yet what we found is that people in their day-to-day work, they would say these things, critical things, but they would still be engaged in this process around debating how needs were operationalised, about coming up with solutions, of better ways of targeting. This person's own organisation is right at the front line of debating what kind of tools are used to assess need. And this is because there's practical pressures on this to do this. You know, they can utter these critiques, but at the end of the day, they still need to find ways of helping the people in front of them. And there's probably no more rational or reasonable or humane way of doing that than targeting housing of those with the greatest needs. So on the basis of this, we argue that reification it's not something people are choosing to do necessarily. It's rather a structural tendency of this problem space that's opened up by residualisation. It's a way in which the policy making debates that are around and solutions that are posed are kind of structures, the practical and discursive imperatives, the conditions that bear on people working in this space and therefore shape their actions. All right, I will wrap up now. Next slide, please, Ali. So just to summarise what I've said, and I've been kind of summarising as I'm going, so you're probably sick of me repeating myself, but one more time just for the fun of it. What we've argued in the paper is that social housing provision plays out within a problem space that's defined by this problem of neediness, this preoccupation with neediness, and which is the consequence of or is shaped by decades of social housing residualisation. Policy making and struggles thereover have come to centre on questions over how neediness is defined and operationalised, drawing attention away from and energy, right? Policy making energy and action away from the problem of social housing scarcity, contributing to the reification of that scarcity. And this has some somewhat paradoxical implications. Next slide, please. As I foreshadowed earlier on, The focus on needs engenders something of a partial re-legitimation of social housing, or, you know, a tendency towards this, right? I mean, there's still plenty of stigmatising discourse out there, you know, public attitudes and in political attitudes, particularly in this state. Recently coming from Queensland, it's a bit more alive here, or explicit, I would say. It's not that it's not in Queensland, but there's a bit more of a sort of unapologetic attitude towards dismissive attitude towards social housing and people in it. Anyway, what we've argued is that this focus on complexity gives rise to a sense that dependence on social housing is not a choice for at least some people, right? The debilitating nature of complex needs means that people cannot be expected or cannot be pushed into the private rental market. There are others that can. This leads to a shift away from tenants as an irresponsible underclass, which was very much the discourse in the English-speaking world through the 90s and 2000s. And we've seen the emergence of a kind of new caring approach. And this is something that Linda Cameron and I have picked up in another paper in the British Journal of Sociology, where we looked at an example in Queensland where the idea of the people with the social housing is increasingly occupied by people with complex needs has resulted in these policy experiments with new caring and supportive approaches to those people when there are tenancy problems. So instead of being like, you're bad, you're going to have 3 strikes and we're going to evict you, there's now a greater effort to connect people up with various kinds of services and support to prevent them losing their tenancies. And this parallels processes that we're seeing are happening in homelessness policy, where the idea that there's a certain group, a very narrow group of very complex, very needy people who can't navigate the usual systems of homelessness support, which are highly conditional and put a lot of emphasis on individual behaviour change, are sort of, you know, we've seen the emergence of things like housing first for people that are seen as unable to manage that system. And I haven't put it on here, but I have an untested theory that what we're sort of will be seeing here is a move away, a shift in how social housing is conceptualised further away from this kind of welfare or ambulance service towards a complete conflation of social housing with supportive housing, that it becomes, for people that are familiar with the literature around supportive housing, a place for those who are unable to live independently and need both the provision of housing, but also often on-site or ready access to support because of the complexity of their need. Next slide, please. The other conclusion, or the sort of flip side of this, is that we see the preoccupation with neediness as further deepening social housing residualisation. So it's both a product of social housing residualisation, but it's something that actually perpetuates and further deepens residualisation. Contrary to my new theory in the paper, we argue that it cements a sense that social housing is a welfare or ambulance service that is only for those who are unable to meet their own needs within the private market, therefore closing down a possible reimagining or reawakening of an understanding of the social housing as a sector that could be expanded as a means of addressing the broader housing crisis that we're facing. And since writing this paper, that crisis has only gotten worse with what we've seen with rising rents, rising rental stress, particularly in regional areas, all of that stuff, and stuff that are problems that we should at least be considering a drastic expansion of social housing as a possible answer to. Another consequence of this is all but the neediest tenants are abandoned to an increasingly unaffordable private rental sector and all those problems I just named. And social housing scarcity is increasingly taken for granted through this problem of, through this focus on neediness. Now, we could have some debate, and maybe we will, in the question whether this still holds, this last point, whether the scarcity is still taken for granted. I think that it is in terms of, you know, the kind of policy community, maybe not amongst the broader set of stakeholders and scholars, but we have seen some shifts, such in Victoria with the, you know, their large investment in social housing. Everyone's making record investment in social housing, it seems, but there doesn't seem to be built that much social housing being built, probably because you have to spend record amounts of money to get a bit of land at the moment, right? So anyway, happy to take questions on that or anything else that I've spoken about. If you could just flick through, Ali, we'll skip the references. I just put up a screenshot of the paper there in case anyone's keen to have a more detailed and coherent account of what I've just tried to convey to you. All right, thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much, Andrew. Who online or in the room, for that matter, would like to make a comment or ask any questions? Can you unmute everybody? Is that?
People should be able to unmute themselves.
Oh, right. Okay.
At any stage.
I'll go while we're waiting for
Laura.
votes. Thanks, Andrew. It was great. I'm just interested. I haven't quite got this question clear in my head, so I hope you can get where I'm going at. But I'm interested. You spoke a few times about, you know, there's the quote about, oh, we don't think government's done a good job of selling social housing, and I'm interested if you've looked at all or thought about how all of this sort of reframing that's going on in the policy bubble is interacting with what's going on in the kind of broader public sphere around how people think about social housing. One of the narratives that's sort of been coming up is, you know, as you said, we've seen the private market get more and more expensive, is eventually we're going to get to the tipping point where people go, oh, we do need this stuff because, you know, my middle class friends and family can't get into housing anymore and we need the government to help.
Yeah.
But I sometimes wonder whether it's the other way, and the connection here I see is with the debate that's going on in the US around student loans. It's like they're talking about forgiving student loans and people go, well, I had to pay student loans, so why should other people not have to pay student loans? And I wonder if, you know, in the housing context, we see that a little bit too. I had to struggle and save for 10 years to get my crappy little apartment. So why? So I wonder if that increasing difficulty is making the broader public more sort of, you know, a greater enthusiasm for social housing or a lessening enthusiasm for social housing.
Look, so I mean, I've not done any kind of systematic analysis around public perceptions. I do think that it is largely taken for granted. I mean, it's part of the culture of liberal welfare states like Australia that social housing is a welfare service that should be targeted based on need, right? I think that, I mean, I remember myself as a social policy student and scholar being quite amazed when I heard about, Nordic welfare states providing welfare on a universal basis, no matter, without income, without means tests and those kind of things. And it sort of was like, I thought that it was naturally the fairest way to do it is for it to be targeted need. And so I think that's quite ingrained, and you even see it amongst people who are on social housing wait lists saying things like, oh look, if you speak to people about how difficult it is, they're like, yes, it's tough, but there are people doing it that tougher than me that are really homeless. I'm only sleeping on my friend's couch with nowhere else to go and potentially going to be kicked out of here soon, but there are people sleeping on the streets that are needier than I am. So I think that it is fairly entrenched sort of in our culture of welfare. But at the same time, just monitoring media and stuff like that, there does seem much more of a recognition of the housing crisis. It's getting harder to avoid, and the potential of social. I mean, if you think just in terms of media coverage, like I do not recall social housing having this much, calls for social housing having this much prominence in the media 5, 10 years ago. So. Yeah, sorry, I can't provide a better account.
Thank you, Andrew. I can see it as a raised hand. I'm not quite sure who it is, but Chris, can you unmute?
Yeah, sure. G'day.
We
Thanks a
can't
lot,
hear you.
Andrew. I'm glad you're
still muted.
thinking so deeply about this stuff because it's very interesting to me too.
You're muted, that's great.
We are the speaker on our side.
Yeah, I think it's us. Yeah, they can hear him online.
Can you hear me now?
Just asking the
I
right.
wonder if.
Do you
Can
want
you
me to
add it
just
in the
jump
chat?
online and
Can
see?
you add your question in the chat? I'm sorry.
All right, go on to someone else and I'll do
Yeah,
that.
that's going on my phone.
Technical difficulties today.
I realise, Chris, just give me a buzz on 04.
There's another question
Should we take this one?
here.
I would maximise, if I was a Minister for Housing, I would maximise the biggest bang for taxpayer buck by delivering social housing the following way. This is what you're asking, Edward, you're asking Andrew to answer, is it? I guess. And the second part of the question is, if I was a Minister for Housing on day one, the demographic group I would prioritise above all others would be question mark. So I guess this is saying, look, this is hard.
Yeah,
And there's
okay.
no,
Yeah,
this is just as, you know, this, what better way is there other than this unsatisfactory way that you've described? I think that's the question, really.
Yeah, I mean, taking the second one first, I tried to say at the end there that I think with the current situation, that the way we're doing it is probably the fairest way of doing it, right? I think that this is what I was trying to, this idea of this being a kind of problem-based that conditions or, you know, shapes the way that we respond to these problems, is that when you do have scarcity, is there a fairer way than finding, you know, who is the neediest? And, you know, I'm not a social worker or a psychologist. Probably these ideas of complex needs, I mean, they do, from what I've read in the research, it makes sense. These people do have the hardest time, are the most likely to become long-term homeless, you know. So I'd probably, without an increase in supply of social housing, do what we're doing. You know?
Andrew, can I just ask you, this is sort of relevant, so I think that question,
Yeah.
just to say something about the documentation requirements. Well, part of the, you know, one of the things that we've really been struck by in the research is that when you're following this track, it's taking you towards a system where the evidence that you need to provide to demonstrate objectively that you need housing more than somebody else can be very demanding, and that has implications.
Yeah.
So do you want to just say a bit more about it?
100%. That's a really interesting point, and I mean it mirrors processes that you see in other areas of welfare, right? So sort of liberal welfare states want to target, you know, welfare things are inefficient, but we end up with this huge amount of bureaucracy around things like mutual obligation, and in social housing around determining need, and so that's like a lot of work for service providers and social housing applicants to demonstrate need. Social housing applications are quite complex forms, and people are required, if they are registering particular needs on the form, to provide evidence of that. And that might be getting a certificate from a psychiatrist or a doctor, a support letter from your caseworker. And this is all very difficult for people who are without stable housing, and who are grappling with these needs, right? The very things that make you potentially a priority for social housing, make it difficult to meet the conditions, to meet the bureaucratic conditions to actually apply. It also places a huge burden on services, where they spend an inordinate amount of time, you know, ferrying people around, arranging appointments and doing those kind of things. They also spend an extreme amount of time finding temporary accommodation for people, putting people up in hotels, moving people between hotels. There was one person in Queensland who had moved, a family had moved something like, you know, 40 times in a year or something like that. They were just shunted between hotels, and the service had spent all of that time and energy finding new hotel accommodation to put people up in.
Yes.
So it's hugely inefficient. Yeah.
So Edward, that was a good question, and it raised a good I think little thread really. Chris, we still don't have your question in the chat, and although others on the call can hear you, we can't.
We might be able to hear it.
Do you want to try again? Chris, try speaking again. You still appear to be muted.
All right, I'm going to try again. Can you hear me?
Hold on.
I'm so sorry. everybody.
No.
I could hear, no one else can.
All right.
Oh,
Right, in a minute, Andrew's going to repeat the question.
Okay. I was going to ask some thoughts on scarcity and need, and the way they work as housing technologies, if you like. My thought is that attention to need leads housing workers to view tenants as being prone to problems, and that bad stuff happens to them. Bad stuff's to be expected.
It's a long question.
Yeah, okay. Well, let me repeat that part and then you can. So Chris has sort of given us some thoughts that he has a suspicion that the focus on need at the level of actual support to access social housing and those people in government who are, I'm guessing, assessing, it leads them to expect problems from tenants once they get in, because you're documenting all of these struggles that they're having. Yeah, is that correct, Chris?
That's right, but there's another problem, which is that need also makes them very attentive to fraud and to people trying it on, and so you get this negative agency as well, and housing officers switch between they're people who are prone to problems to this sort of fraudulent negative agent as well.
Yeah, okay. So I don't know if you guys heard that, but Chris is saying that another implication would be an attention or a suspicion around fraud. So you're talking about people fraudulently representing their needs.
Yeah, and housing workers are very attentive to well, that was my experience or my theory anyway. I wonder if you have in your more recent research picked up whether that has changed, whether the need algorithm has meant that this sort of human interpretation of this negative human interpretation may have been surpassed, and where the technology has changed, or whether this this dangerous negative take on need might still be lurking in the system.
Yeah. Okay. So I think people were able to hear that time. I wasn't.
The weird voice from the computer.
So Chris is in the cupboard whispering to us. Chris was asking about whether there's an attentiveness, or in his experience, there's an attentiveness to people fraudulently representing their needs, and a kind of suspicion. And I think this really intersects with the last question, I think was from Ed, and then your follow-up question, Hal, about the
Evidence.
Evidence, exactly, that's right, and the bureaucracy around demonstrating need. I think that might be a reflection of that suspicion, right? That you can't just put down that you have certain sets of needs, that you have severe mental health issue or whatever. You need an expert to verify that for you. I don't know if I have many other thoughts on that I don't know how new that is, or if that's different to what you were seeing, Chris, and you were sort of implying that it might have been a more human sort of suspicion and interpersonal, whereas now there is sort of bureaucratic architecture there to prevent that from taking place, possibly. I can't remember the first half of your question now.
No, it was just about need being a dangerous thing, and maybe the technologies around it have changed to ameliorate that somewhat. But we can talk about it directly some other time.
We're out of time. I mean, the one thing I would say to that is that the fact that social housing is starting to increasingly resemble supportive housing is maybe a reflection of that. The idea of you're targeting housing at people with the greatest needs, seeing all of these needs, as people are coming in, there's an impetus then, well, how are we going to manage this once people are actually in housing? And so there's an experimentation with new supportive initiatives for at-risk tenants, as they tend to be called. Yeah.
Well, I think we probably should draw a line under it there because we've gone past 5. And thank Andrew very much again, and a little bit of technological challenge and a couple of stages through that event. So thanks to you who have remained with us online in the meantime, and frustrating that you could hear questions from your colleagues and we couldn't. But anyway, I think we kind of explored a few of the issues that went beyond the presentation itself, and the presentation itself was also very interesting too, I think. So
thanks everyone.
Thanks very much.
We'll
be holding one final seminar in the current series next week, I think, next Friday, and then we'll have a little break and come back on the 10th of June. So thanks very much, everybody.